All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Wallmeyer, and I am the local history librarian here at Johnson County Library. Thank you all for attending today's program, The Past Is Prologue, Lessons in Activism from LGBTQ Kansas. The Past Is Prologue is a bi-monthly program offered by Johnson County Library, where we highlight topics that are often left out, glossed over, or misrepresented in our history books. Before we begin, we want to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A engagement tool, and we will try to answer all of these at the end of the program. An on-demand version of this webcast will be available within the next 2 weeks and can be accessed on Johnson County Library's YouTube channel or on our website at jocolibrary.org/events/on-demand. We would also like to begin today with a brief land acknowledgement. Our Johnson County Library locations stand on the ancestral and treaty lands of Native American peoples, including the Kansas, Kaskaskia, Kickapoo, Osage, Peoria, Sioux, and Shawnee. We pay respects to all Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, for their continuing presence in this land and the land where you may be joining us from tonight. Now, please join me in welcoming CJ Janovy.
Is this where I say hello, everyone?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. CJ here. The strange thing is that I can't actually see you. I'm happy all of you are here, though I've seen a list of folks who signed up tonight, and I know that some friends are on that list. Thank you. And lots of hopefully new friends. And I thought what I would do tonight, that the great folks at the Johnson County Library, I'm honored by the invitation. It's always an honor to get to talk to folks, and they didn't really give me any instructions for tonight, so I kind of made some stuff up based on the theme, Past is Prologue, and I've taken some liberties with how I'm defining the past and how I'm defining prologue. And so this, I've got some slides together, some of them from my talks that I give about my book, No Place Like Home, Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas, which was published on January 29th, Kansas Day, 2018 by the University Press of Kansas. So some of those slides, if you've seen that talk, some of those slides are here, and that will be review. But I want to go farther back, actually, from the time of the book. And so if you'll bear with me, and I'm sharing my screen, and I'm getting my slides into the proper format here. I want to start here with this picture that's sort of the inspiration for why I wrote a book about LGBTQ activism in Kansas. This is a photo from election night in April 2005, and this group of folks you can see are some distressed looking observers of election night results. And this is the night that 70% of Kansas voters banned same-sex marriage in the state of Kansas. And this was part of a national movement in the mid-2000s. Many states did this. Missouri did it in 2004. It was the sort of culture war issue of the time. So this was 2005. Here's 2015, 10 years later, a short decade later. And by then, the feelings of the public had changed pretty dramatically, almost entirely reversed. 55% of Americans were perfectly fine with same-sex marriage just a decade after 70% of folks. Higher percentages in some states, lower in other states, but really a remarkable turnaround in public opinion during that decade. And I had watched that public opinion change over the course of the years, and that's what I wanted to write about, and really did write about in No Place Like Home. I knew that activists all over the state of Kansas had gone to work. And the way I summarized it was, you know, a bunch of politically naive Kansans realizing they were unfairly under attack, rolled up their sleeves, went looking for fights, and ended up making friends in one of the most hostile places in the country. And that's my quick summary of the plot of No Place Like Home. I'll talk a little bit more about how things ended up for everyone in a minute, but I wanted to show you a picture of a couple of the people that I met during the course of my reporting. This is Cara Vaughn and Eddie Ibarra from Hutchinson. They were high school students. This picture was taken at a dance for queer kids at Hutchinson High School. This was the GSA spring dance in April 2015, and you know, these kids are, you know, I don't think Cara might have been 16 when I interviewed her. And what was so amazing to me, other than how happy and beautiful these kids are, and that they had started a gay straight alliance at Hutchinson High. That was what it was called at the time. I think those clubs have different names now. But when I interviewed Cara around this time, she was 16. She didn't even know the story of the same-sex marriage bans around the country. She'd been like, you know, 6 years old when Kansas was banning same-sex marriage. And so she was sort of shocked when I interviewed her to know this history that was very recent to me. So it made me think a lot about my own history and my own past as prologue to doing this work. I'm 61 years old now, and that means that I really came of age in my own activism back in the mid 80s. And I have no idea how old everyone is on this Zoom tonight. I can't see how many folks with gray hair are watching, but so I have no idea how many of you might remember this scene on the left. This is the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. The first time it was ever unrolled on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in October of 1987. There was a March on Washington, 500,000 people. Estimates vary, but 500,000 is what I think I saw that weekend. That's me there on the right with my big mullet. I'm carrying a big sign. I was working in San Francisco for a national gay rights law firm at the time, and this was a pretty momentous weekend of events in DC. People came from all over the country and marched to urge the Supreme Court in 1986, just a year earlier, had said that it was perfectly legal to arrest two consenting as adults of the same sex, you know, having mutual consensual sex in their own bedroom. That was ruled the felony of sodomy by the U.S. Supreme Court. Said we could be arrested for having sex in our own bedrooms. So we were angry about that. We were angry at the Reagan administration's really sort of criminal response to the AIDS crisis. And we marched, and many people met at that march and went back to their towns and organized their towns. And there are folks in the book who talk about having been at this same march. I didn't see them there, but I know what that felt like. The next sort of big thing politically, as I'm talking about the past being prologue, in the early 90s, Bill Clinton campaigned on ending the ban of gays in the military. And I think I might be, yeah, maybe you can see those two headlines in the New York Times, 1992. Bill Clinton was the first president to really campaign to court the gay vote and gay campaign contributions at the time in the early 90s. And I was pretty politically naive myself at the time, but I could see this was a very risky strategy and not courting the gay vote was not risky, but promising to change the ban on gays in the military was extremely risky. And after Clinton was elected, we saw how that turned out. We ended up with the ridiculous policy of don't ask, don't tell. And that really was sort of my first experience watching a community be betrayed by the politicians that had promised something to us. Where am I? Next big advancements during those times. If you're a Kansan, you may be aware of Melissa Etheridge, who was everyone who heard her music, well, the lesbians who heard her music and were fans all knew that she was gay before she came out herself at Bill Clinton's inauguration in 1993. And then Ellen came out, and this really changed the pop culture conversation. Elton John came out, I think in 92 or 93 as well. And before that, we didn't really have out gay celebrities, and now we do. Another thing that happened, okay, so same-sex marriage really, so that was what happened in the 90s. And so we saw this progress. We saw presidents courting the gay vote. We saw celebrities coming out. We saw the LGBTQ community asserting its power. And same-sex marriage was not particularly a thing that was on a lot of our radar at the time, but there was movement. And I just real quickly here, back in 72 was the first time that the Supreme Court considered same-sex marriage. Maryland, for some reason, decided to take some action on that. It wasn't until 1993, 93 Hawaii Supreme Court rule. This is sort of the beginning of the troubles here. So Hawaii Supreme Court says maybe it's unconstitutional to deny same-sex couples the ability to marry. And Bill Clinton, this was the bigger betrayal than the gays, than the don't ask, don't tell policy, was that Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act, really sort of trying to head off a potent political issue. That was 96. The Hawaii case begins to look, troublesome for opponents of same-sex marriage. And then, this idea of domestic partnerships and civil unions, and really just sort of legitimizing legally same-sex relationships becomes a movement. And by November 2003, the Massachusetts Supreme Court has legalized same-sex marriage. And this, some of the folks that I write about in the book, this is Gary Martins and Larry Bunker of Salina. And when I spoke to them, they were remembering these days, and they were like, gay marriage was not a thing that was really top of mind. Larry, who is there on the left, says, I didn't, marriage had never been an idea. He's just happy not to get beaten up. He didn't want to get hurt, killed, and harassed all the time. But this, because this was an issue really that the conservatives, Karl Rove, saw as a way to energize conservatives and freak out Democrats and liberals, because no one was really brave enough to stand up against this political wedge issue that we then had to fight back against. So it was sort of widely assumed and attributed that the same-sex marriage issue was supposedly helpful in getting voters out to elect George W. Bush in 2004. And this was in the news at the time, that voters who were really concerned about moral values were among those who helped get George Bush elected. And again, this is the same time that all these states are, it was really important, especially, for example, I remember the debate in Missouri. There was a big fight over, is the same-sex marriage ban in Missouri going to be on the August ballot or the November ballot? And the conservatives wanted it on the November ballot, when it would drive the moral values voters, more of them, out to the polls to help elect George Bush. What happened later, though, some political scientists went back and looked at that conclusion at the time and realized maybe it wasn't as simple as it sounded. Maybe the political rhetoric that got all the traction at the time wasn't quite what we understood it to be. And so it's, as a journalist and I guess a sort of de facto historian, this caused me to sort of recalibrate what I thought had happened at the time, because it certainly seemed like the values voters had expressed they had voted in accordance with their values, but maybe it was a poorly devised exit poll question that led to those results. I don't know that there's been a ton of other research about this phenomenon, but it's worth noting now. But that gets us back to the vote in Kansas to ban same-sex marriage. So again, we've just sort of described this time period that we went through. This past is prologue to these unhappy faces. The marriage ban in Kansas didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a very calculated political strategy across the whole country. And there's just a picture of this is really sort of what got me interested in writing about what was going on in Kansas. This article that I read in the Kansas City Star in 2012, which was about what was going on in Hutchinson. I started seeing news that a few people in smallish cities in Kansas were going to City Hall and saying, can you add sexual orientation and gender identity to the non-discrimination ordinances in the town? And this was stirring things up. And I was surprised that this was happening in, to me, unexpected places in Kansas. So I began to investigate, and I ended up writing about what had happened in Hutchinson and what had happened in Salina and also Manhattan in those days around 2011, 2012. These efforts to pass non-discrimination ordinances ultimately failed. They would either get repealed by a referendum or they would not pass at City Hall. This is the website for Awaken Kansas, which was the opponent of adding non-discrimination ordinances and protecting religious liberty for Kansans. And these folks would they were the opponents. And so again, it was really what happened was, in all of these cities, because it was a debate at City Hall, because there were newspaper stories about it, because there were people talking to their neighbors and holding town hall meetings, this kind of thing, it really sort of educated the communities there. And I had people who told me, we didn't get our rights written into city ordinance, but we created a community. We realized that we had a lot of friends and supporters out there. And I love to tell the story about how in Salina, they didn't get their ordinance passed, but they made all these friends, and they decided they would put on the first LGBTQ pride ever in Salina, and they booked a room at a conference hotel, and they planned to have 200 people show up, and actually 500 people showed up, and they had built a community, and so good things came out of this effort, even though they might have lost at the ballot box. This is this picture is the folks in Manhattan celebrating finally getting their non-discrimination ordinance passed in 2016 after trying it for several times. And what you see here on the left then is just a lot of other cities passing these ordinances to protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. And so there's sort of a domino effect in Johnson County, and a lot of this is, especially starting in 2018, a lot of this activity is very community-based. Some of you probably know more about it than I do at this point. And much of it is in response to the 2016 presidential election. And so you have more folks getting involved, people realizing they need to step up and start becoming activists and support the folks who are under attack. So this is progress that starts to happen. And I'm going to talk now a little bit about some of the trans folks that I met along the way. Some of you may know Stephanie Mott. She was a early activist. She wrote a column for the Liberty Press, and she was a great public speaker. And she had a really powerful story of growing up on a farm outside of Lawrence and, struggling with her gender identity, being assigned male at birth and struggling all along and finding herself homeless and addicted and in a men's shelter and going to a church and actually really sort of being born again and beginning to live authentically as Stephanie. And she would go and tell this story to whoever would listen. She would talk to, student groups, church groups, organizations that had brown bag lunches for speakers at offices. And she in 2011, over the 4th of July weekend, she decided that she would drive all around the state of Kansas and randomly talk to people about what they knew about anything transgender related. And she called this the Transgender Tour of Kansas. And what she realized was that people needed education. And so she started, she was surprised. Most people, she'd go up to them and say, I'm Stephanie, I'm an author, I'm writing about transgender issues. Do you know anyone who's transgender? Do you know anything about it? And most people, she said, would say something like either, is that like gay? Or they would say they didn't know anyone who was trans. And then she would introduce herself and say that she was. And most people, she said, really Kansans had a sort of live and let live feeling about all of this, or surprising numbers of folks did know someone who was trans. And so she really realized that the legislature that was already starting to float anti-transgender bills wasn't really, in her mind, not representing the Kansas that she knew and that she was seeing. And so she started the Kansas statewide transgender education project. She served as on the board of directors of Equality Kansas. And she was just out there in public. She was leading rallies on the Capitol steps. She was on TV, and she died in 2019 suddenly of a heart attack. And it was a huge loss for the community because she was so visible and so out there. Sandra Mead was another trans woman who was leading Equality Kansas from 2013 to 2015. She was another person who was very visible, very in front of the media, publicly speaking, testifying at the Kansas legislature, a real trans leader in Kansas. And I point out these two women specifically because out in the rest of America, it wasn't really until Caitlyn Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair in 2015 that trans identity became, a pop culture celebrity thing. And Time magazine famously put Laverne Cox on the cover in 2014, and so Time was a little bit ahead of the curve here, noticing that trans people were entering public life. And but I will just remind you all that I was talking about Sandra Mead and Stephanie Mott, who were out and visible in Kansas years before these two folks were on the covers of these national magazines. So I like to think of Kansas being ahead of the country in that regard. By the time my book came out in January of 18, things were looking up for LGBTQ people in Kansas. This is Luke Ben-Simone. He was among 4 folks who won a consent decree from the state of Kansas to be able to change the gender markers on their birth certificates. And this had happened as a result of a legal strategy, partly Stephanie Mott was involved in, but Luke was one of the plaintiffs in that case. You can see the TV cameras were there recording that. Happy day for trans folks. Kansans decide to send an out lesbian American Indian Sharice Davids to Congress in 2018. This was another sort of surprising development for Kansas politics. That same year, folks in Johnson County sent 2 openly gay folks to represent them in the Kansas State House. These are your representatives, Johnson County. So again, things are looking up. My book came out and it was about all this activism, and it seemed as if all of this work was coming to fruition, and LGBTQ folks were making great gains politically and culturally. And so November 2020, Stephanie Byers is elected. She's the first openly trans person ever elected to the Kansas legislature. She's from Wichita. So again, this is sort of unheard of or unimaginable or surprising developments for Kansans. But the backlash is already well in effect by then. So Stephanie Byers' first session in the Kansas State House in 2021 is accompanied by the first big wave of anti-trans legislation that's starting to happen. The effort to ban trans folks from participating in sports that match their gender identity was the big thing that happened. This was also happening all around the country, so it wasn't just Kansas, it was everywhere. And it was really, someone old enough to remember the national movement around gay marriage from 15 years earlier. This was the tactics, the language, all of this was beginning to feel very, very familiar to me. The first couple of years that these bills were out, Kansas Governor Laura Kelly vetoed them. Again, the legislation just kept coming back. So this slide was from last legislative session. All around the country, we were looking at 426 anti-LGBTQ bills in legislatures around the country. It's still early in the new legislative sessions, but we're already seeing those bills, and we're seeing them coming back with a vengeance. At the same time, we're seeing this conversation about critical race theory coming up nationally as an issue. And, you know, this is also a couple of years after the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020. And so these are cultural I don't even know quite what cultural campaigns to political campaigns all around the country focused on vulnerable communities. So people of color, Black people specifically, LGBTQ people, there's these parallel lines of attack on progress that these communities have made. And again, it's feeling very coordinated, very organized, and the tactics are feeling very familiar to me. This is last year, 44 by middle of the spring, 44 states had tried to take some kind of make some kind of laws restricting what could be taught in schools about systemic racism in the country. So what I was feeling, what I was noticing happening all over again, like I had seen in cycles previously, was political rhetoric that was designed to make people afraid. And I called up Dr. Donald Saucier from K-State University, who's a psychological, sorry, I can't see my own slide there, psychologist, social scientist, teaching, specializes in political rhetoric, among many other things. And he said to me, you know, that this tactic of a politician trying to make people afraid of things that they don't understand or things that they think might, you know, change their way of life, something unusual, something they're not used to, something that they don't know, and so it makes them afraid. And he said that he thinks this is a political tactic that's been used for millennia. The oldest trick in the book, basically, the tactic is be afraid of these people. They are a threat to your way of life. Vote for me, I'll keep you safe. And that's what I had seen happening all along. And it seems to me to be very obvious, this political trick, but it also seems to work, especially when culture is undergoing rapid change like this. So one of the things that was cool about writing this book was that some fellow journalists, I don't know how we're doing on time here. I think we have a couple minutes. I can maybe play the trailer for the documentary that I was able to work on with some of my colleagues at KCUR, where I work, and also Kansas's amazing filmmaker Kevin Wilmot. I'll see if I can actually play this on the Zoom screen here.
Let's be real. Life can get tough, to say the least, and especially without someone to talk to. And as men, this topic seems to be brushed off when it doesn't need to.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
Homophobia.
The bullying I'm going to talk about today is legislative bullying.
Watching someone's rights get taken away, and to know that 70% of Kansans voted to do that.
They are politicizing trans identity to the point where they want to legislate it out of existence.
I find it incredibly insulting to use the hyperbole that there will be blood on our hands.
There have been 10 measures introduced in this building attacking transgender children.
You're telling children like my daughter that she is less than other children.
There are going to be real vulnerable people who are actually going to be affected by this policy. And they're thinking, is this the state where I really have a home? Is there really a place for me? Am I wanted in this state? Do I belong in this state?
So I got to work on that film with Kevin, and I imagine a few of you may have seen it. And what's sad about the film is that it involves the stories of two young trans Kansans who did not survive the last few years of political rhetoric. And so, you know, it's a life or death situation now in America for folks who are under attack. You know, it's I think history is filled with examples of what happens when the power of the state, any state, is used to demonize and make a certain minority group feel less than human to their neighbors. And we know how that turns out, and it's never good. So the final message really from the book, from all of the things that have happened since the book came out, things that we're watching happen now, what I always tell people is there were, you know, the subtitle of my book is Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas. And there's a lot of lessons. There's a lot of people in this book, but 3 themes emerged. And one of them is prepare to lose. Anytime you're gonna be an activist and you're up against powerful systems or power structures, you're probably going to lose the first time, the first 2 or 3 times, but you build community, you find allies, and eventually you can change things. You can eventually win, whether it's at the ballot box or with people's hearts and minds. Another thing that I always tell people is to be gentle with your allies, especially these days when people are afraid and angry, and social media is a place where people are quick to jump to conclusions, and language is changing, and people don't always know what the best language is, or what they should be doing or saying, and it's easy to get bogged down in internal disputes with folks who are on your side. And so that was just a lesson from the book, and that I've seen over all of these years is, you know, be gentle with the folks who are your allies, and keep the focus on the folks who are really trying to hurt you or hurt your loved ones. And finally, just do something. In the book, there are a lot of examples of folks who went to City Hall and talked to the newspapers, or, you know, organized rallies. But there's also examples of folks who just wrote anonymous checks or anonymous cards, or folks who baked lemon bars. And so I think just whatever folks are able to do, they should just do something. And so those are the main lessons. And that's the end of my prepared remarks, I think, for this evening. And so I'm happy to try to clarify anything that didn't make sense, or answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation, CJ. We have had a question come in about where you can stream the documentary.
You can't stream the documentary yet. There have been quite a few screenings since it was first released last April, and we have a few more coming up. We have one at a church in Johnson County on February 4th. We have another one scheduled for Kansas City on March 13th. We're showing in Manhattan on April 25th. And these will be linked. The website is noplacelikeHome.com or .org.
.com, I have it up.
Okay, thank you. And so we'll add those to the website, and it's also shown on PBS a few times. Eventually it will be on YouTube or some other streaming service, but we're still showing it in at events, and we're happy to show it to any group that can put together a screening.
Perfect, thank you. Oh, someone on from Topeka who says they miss Stephanie Mott so much. So
Yes,
I
we
know
all do.
that sentiment is shared a lot, yes. A question, what gives you hope for trans people going forward with the political climate right now?
A lot of things give me hope for trans folks right now. First and foremost, the beauty and strength and resilience of the LGBTQ community in general always gives me hope. Also, the support of allies. I know that even if the political attacks are very, very loud and the politicians who are passing the laws right now are saying really hateful and unconscionable things, I know that there is more love and support that's out there in the non-political world than it often feels like. And I think that, love wins. We've seen this over and over again. And I think that one of the in the film, and I believe this is true, one of the folks in the films talks about this feeling like the last throes of homophobia and transphobia and some of these other phobias. You know, the the um the new world is coming, and it's a different world. It's one where we know more about science. We know more about gender. We know about identity. We are more free. The young people, all of the new generations are more free. And that's creating more of a backlash, more resistance. I feel like the more progress you make, the more severe the backlash. And that's what we're seeing right now. And folks just have to hold on until we get to the other side of it. There's a lot of things right now that are making that feel more daunting, maybe, than certainly in a lot of people's lifetimes. Those of us who are old enough to remember things like the AIDS crisis, I remember at the very beginning in the very early 80s, and there were no treatments available. You got AIDS, you knew you were going to die. And I remember hearing at some point, there's some treatments coming along, but they won't be ready for 30 years. And I thought, all of us thought 30, you couldn't imagine 30 years. 30 years was not soon enough. People were dying right now. But look at how different life is now. I mean, AIDS is still a problem and people are still dying, but it's a manageable disease and there are treatments now and you can live. And that's one benefit of being old enough to have lived through history, is that you do see that the world does change. And the only the only way to have hope, especially when you feel hopeless, is just to act as if you do have hope. So you take some kind of action, even though it feels hopeless, or even though you think you're going to lose, and you might lose. But you still have to take the action that will move the universe a little bit farther in that direction. And you might not see the results of it immediately, but it does work over time.
And kind of related to that question, tying in, what do you think the political attitudes towards LGBTQ folks in Johnson County are right now?
I can't speak for Johnson Countyans, but I can say that Johnson Countyans protected LGBTQ folks over the course of a couple years, less than a couple years, in 2018 and 2019. All those cities passed non-discrimination ordinances to make the place safer for folks who live there. And it may not feel as safe because of all the political rhetoric that's coming out of the Kansas legislature, but Johnson County has also been electing, or almost electing, much more supportive candidates. And so I actually would love to hear from Johnson Countyans how they're feeling. I can't answer that question for you guys.
To tie in with the ordinances that were passed in 2017, 2018, up through 2020 and 2021, are there any major towns or cities in Kansas that don't have a protected status based on gender identities or sexual orientation?
I don't know what, it doesn't seem like out west and in the southwest part of the state, I haven't heard of that happening, but I'm very probably not up to speed. And so I think Equality Kansas is a good place to check on that.
Mhm. All right, let's see. Going back to your book, how did you find the people to interview for your book?
Some of the folks I found because the newspapers in their towns had written about them, so I called and talked to them also. One of the first people I spoke with was Sandra Stenzel out in Trigo County. And I spoke with Sandra because I called Tom Witt, who at the time was the head of Equality Kansas. And I knew Tom because I had been a reporter, or I was a reporter, and I said that I was interested in writing about what had happened after the marriage amendment passed and excuse me, what the consequences of that had been. And so I asked Tom, is there anyone you can think of, Tom, who had an especially intense experience, either positive or negative, as a result of their work as an activist trying to stop that same-sex marriage ban from passing in Kansas? And he told me to call Sandra Stenzel. And Sandra had a terrible experience. She was the development director. She was the director of economic development in Trigo County. Everyone basically knew she was gay, but they liked her. She came from a good, well-known family. She was well regarded. She had actually brought some economic development to Trigo County, but she went to Topeka and she testified against putting the marriage ban on the April ballot. And she said, it's already hard enough to get people to move to Kansas, and it don't make my job as an economic development director any harder than it already is. And she got quoted in papers all over the state, and she lost her job in Trigo County as a result of it. There were forces in Waukene who were not pleased to have a lesbian speaking on behalf of their community. And so it wasn't just that she got fired, it was a whole series of events and town hall meetings and really sort of public humiliations that she endured. And when I called her, she said, I don't know how to tell my story without I don't want to sound like a victim. And then she began to tell this story, and I was like, that's a very intense story. But then I went back and found all the newspaper stories that had, that had accompanied this time, and it was all documented. Her story checked out. Everything that she told me was the same thing that had been reported in the papers there. I talked to other folks who had watched it, and after the book came out, she had sort of isolated for 10 years as a result of that, that experience in her hometown. And after the book came out, she paid me one of the biggest compliments as a journalist, as an author, the fact that she would share this story with me and I would put it out there in the world. And she said when she saw it when she saw it written out, that someone else had listened, done the reporting, done the fact checking, she realized she wasn't a victim. She wasn't crazy. The things that had happened to her actually was really bad, and it helped her heal. And another thing that had happened was when the book first came out in January of 2018, we had a book launch party at the Lawrence Library, and folks who were in the book came. So there was, you know, folks from Salina and Manhattan and Hutchinson, and Wichita, even someone who lived in Iowa had driven down, and they were all in the same room together, and they didn't know each other until that time. And so, you know, Stephanie Mott and Sandra were on a panel with me for the book release party, and then you know, at the very beginning, I said, you know, everyone who's in the book, can you just stand up? And it was such a beautiful thing to see, like, you know, they stood up in this room full of people, applauded them, and they just sort of soaked it up, and it was so cool to watch them getting that recognition, but also to see them seeing each other, and they connected, and they've, you know, I can see on social media that they're all friends now, and that's a cool thing. And I'm straying pretty far from the question, but you know, when you're a reporter, you have ways of finding people. You ask people, you know,
Mhm.
you know anyone who had this experience, and then you talk to one person, and then they'll tell you to talk to another person, or they'll say, you know, check out this thing that happened somewhere else. And that's one of the easier the things about reporting. There were a lot of people who did not want to talk to me. There were a lot of people who had been involved, and I was able to find them, and they just, you know, said that experience was too painful, or I just don't want to revisit, or whatever. And so there's a lot of people, there's so many more people's stories who could have been in the book, but I had to stop at some point.
Thank you. Are you working on another book right now?
I might ask the questioner to define working on.
Fair enough.
I think I'm always working on another book, but I'm nowhere near close to having another one out in the world.
What are some topics you're currently researching?
You know, I'm interested in this time. I talked about it a little bit tonight. You know, that moment when Melissa Etheridge comes out publicly, finally, and to me, there was a before and after from that moment. You know, there's the before is, you know, these singers and pop stars are gay, and you know that when they sing you know, when Melissa Etheridge sings a love song and she says you, she's not talking about a guy. And we all knew that, but now everybody knows that. And so I'm interested in this change in pop culture, the time that we had to sort of translate it or decode it, or look for the coded messages in a lot of top 40 songs is kind of what I'm working on right now.
Interesting. Related, somebody wants to know, what was it like to meet Melissa Etheridge?
I didn't meet her for this movie.
Uh-huh.
There were other folks who made her narration happen.
Mhm.
I did do a story about her in the early 90s. I hung out with her for a day and some other folks in her entourage, and it was very cool. But you know, she's a professional, and she's you know, when a reporter is there with her, she is in professional mode. And so actually that was before she came out also, and so I was sort of hoping for a story that I was not able to get.
All right, thank you. I think we have one more question. Besides Equality Kansas, are there other places that you would recommend for people to get more involved, or just to find more information?
Well, it depends on what kind of information you're looking for. You know, you know, Equality Kansas is the central repository, I think, for LGBTQ political efforts in Kansas, but there are other LGBTQ community organizations. There are, you know, there are community centers. I should have had a list of them written down, but I think if you just sort of do some Googling, you can find places where you could be of help.
All right, excellent. I think that wraps up our Q&A portion of the program. So thank you again for coming to present to us and telling us all about your book. It is available in the library. You can place it on hold right now.
Please support your library, everyone. I can't see you, but I feel you. You look great out there in my imagination.
Yes, everyone is beautiful. Thank you so much for all the Johnson County Library staff who could help make this program possible. Our next Past Is Prologue program will be on Tuesday, March 5th at 6:30 p.m. when Dr. Frederick Gooding speaks about his book, Black Oscars From Mammy to Minnie, What the Academy Awards Tell Us About African Americans. So thank you again for attending tonight, and we will hopefully see you at our next program.